The air in the hotel room was cold and still. It was the kind of manufactured cold that sinks into your bones. A constant low hum from the vent overhead. Outside, the Seattle rain fell in a steady sheet, blurring the city lights into long watercolor strokes against the dark glass of the window. I had been in town for 3 days, wrapping up a fugitive apprehension. A simple job. Find a man who didn't want to be found, put him in cuffs, and hand him off. It was clean, procedural, and a million miles away from my other life, the one with family. It was 2:00 the morning. The case was closed. My flight back to DC was at 9, and for the first time in 72 hours, my mind was quiet. I was lying in the dark listening to the rain, letting the tension of the job finally drain away. That's when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. A single sharp vibration that cut through the silence. I never ignored a buzz at 2 a.m. In my line of work, a call at that hour usually meant something had gone wrong. A breach. An escape. An officer down. My heart gave a familiar, sickening lurch as I reached for the phone. My fingers already tracing the patterns I would need to make calls, to mobilize, to act. But it wasn't a call from work. It was a text message from my mother. I squinted at the bright screen, my eyes adjusting. The message was short, and for a moment, the words didn't make any sense. Finally did something about that house of yours. You're welcome. I read it again and again. That house of yours. There was only one house she could be talking about. My house. The beautiful 5-bedroom colonial in Alexandria, Virginia, with the deep green shutters and the old oak tree in the front yard. A house I hadn't stepped inside in over a year. A house that was, on paper, mine. My name was on the deed. It was a relic from a complex inheritance my grandfather had left me, specifically me, years ago. He'd always said I was the only one in the family with a steady head on my shoulders. The irony felt like a punch to the gut. The house was worth $2.8 million. It was also a designated federal asset. My thumb trembled as I pressed the call button next to her name. It rang once, twice, and then her voice, cheerful and entirely too awake, filled the silence. Elena, I was hoping you'd see my text. I didn't want to wake you, but I was just so excited. My own voice came out as a strained whisper. Mom, what did you do? I did what you never would, Margaret Vance said, a note of pride in her voice that made my blood run cold. I sold it. That big empty house you were just sitting on. It was a waste. Honey, all that money tied up in bricks and wood. You were never there. You're never anywhere. The words were a familiar jab. My job. My distance. My supposed neglect of the family. But I couldn't focus on that now. My mind was racing, trying to catch up with the catastrophe that was unfolding. Who did you sell it to? Mom, I asked, keeping my voice as level as I could. Panic was a luxury I couldn't afford. A lovely company. They paid in cash. Can you believe it? No fuss at all. And the best part is the money is going to a good cause. What good cause? I whispered, though I already knew the answer. Chloe's wedding. Of course. Your sister deserves the best. And that fiancé of hers has very expensive taste. Now she can have that reception at the country club she's always dreamed of. She is going to be so happy. We are all so happy. Aren't you happy for your sister? I felt the air leave my lungs. My sister Chloe, the golden child, the one whose needs always came first. Her perfect wedding funded by the sale of a property that wasn't just a house. It was a sanctuary. It was a promise. It was a U.S. Marshals Service Safehouse. For the past 8 months, it had been home to Sophia Russo and her 2 small children. Sophia was the widow of a high-ranking mob accountant and the federal government's star witness in the case against the Romano organized crime family. Her testimony was the key to dismantling their entire East Coast operation. In exchange for her cooperation, we had promised her safety. We had promised her a new life. We had hidden her in a quiet suburban neighborhood in a house that belonged to a low-level administrative government employee who was never there. A perfect cover. My cover. Mom, I said, my voice shaking now. I couldn't stop it. You can't sell that house. It's not just a house. She sighed. A long, dramatic sound of parental frustration. Oh, Elena, don't be so difficult. It's done. The papers are signed. It's not your problem anymore. Honestly, you should be thanking me. And you should really call your sister. She's been trying to talk to you about bridesmaid dresses. I froze. My blood turned to ice in my veins. The disconnect was staggering. While she was celebrating a wedding reception, she had just handed the keys to a protected federal witness to God knows who. For cash? No background check. No questions asked. She had sold a federal property. She had sold a safe house. And she thought she was doing me a favor. I have to go, I said, my voice flat and dead. Elena, don't you dare hang up on me after all I've done. I ended the call. My hand was shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. For a second, I just stood there in the middle of the cold, dark room, the rain beating against the window like a drum. The 2 halves of my life, so carefully separated, had just collided. My family, with their petty dramas and their casual cruelty, had just reached into my world, the world of life and death, and set it on fire. My mother's words echoed in my head. You're welcome. My fingers were numb. I stared at my phone, at my mother's name on the screen, and felt a wave of nausea. But there was no time for shock. Shock gets people killed. I closed my eyes for a single brief second, pushing down the image of my mother's smiling face, pushing down the sound of my sister's name. I forced myself to breathe in, out, Think like a marshal, not like a daughter. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb hovering over the name I hoped I'd never have to call at this hour. Silas Thorne, Deputy Chief Marshal. My boss. A man who did not suffer fools and did not tolerate mistakes. And this was not a mistake. This was a 5-alarm disaster. I pressed the call button. The time on the screen read 2:17 a.m. He answered on the first ring, his voice sharp and instantly alert with no trace of sleep. Vance? Sir, I said, my voice tight. It's Elena. I'm in Seattle. I know where you are. What is it? I took another breath. The words felt like stones in my mouth. Sir, my parents just sold my house in Alexandria. There was a pause on the other end of the line. It was only for a second, but it felt like an eternity. In that silence, I could hear the hum of servers, the distant sound of a phone ringing in the DC command center. Thorne's world never slept. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously calm. The Safehouse? The one housing the Russo family? Yes. Sir? The words were barely a whisper. I could feel my career, my entire life crumbling around me. Everything I had worked for, the trust I had earned, it was all turning to dust. Another pause, and then a quiet, forceful curse. Jesus Christ. The calm was gone. In its place was a cold, hard urgency that snapped me back to attention. Get on a plane now. I have a flight at 9. Forget 9. Get to the airport. Book the first flight out to DC. I don't care what it costs. The service will handle it. A car will meet you on the tarmac at Dulles. Be on it. The line went dead. The next hour was a blur of frantic mechanical motion. I threw my clothes into my bag, my hands moving with practiced efficiency while my mind reeled. I checked out of the hotel in a daze, the night clerk giving me a strange look as I stood there in tactical pants and a wrinkled shirt, my face pale under the fluorescent lights. I got into a cab and gave the driver the address for SeaTac Airport, my voice sounding distant and unfamiliar to my own ears. As the cab sped through the empty, rain-slicked streets of Seattle, I pulled out my service phone. It was already lit up with encrypted messages. Emergency Protocol 7 activated. Asset compromise. Witness 34B. All units stand by. TAC response team prepping for relocation. Intel Division flagged a cash sale on Alexandria property. Source of funds unknown. A massive machine was grinding into motion. All because of a text message. All for a wedding. The absurdity of it was nauseating. While my sister was picking out floral arrangements, a team of heavily armed federal agents was preparing to evacuate a family in the dead of night. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the cab window and thought about Sophia Russo. I had been on her security detail for the first month after we brought her in. I remembered her 2 kids, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, both with their mother's dark, expressive eyes. They were quiet, scared children who had seen too much. They had been sleeping peacefully in their beds an hour ago, believing they were safe, believing we could protect them. And I, Elena Vance, was the reason they were in danger. My name on the deed. My family. My failure. It didn't matter that I hadn't known. In my job, ignorance wasn't an excuse. It was a vulnerability. And the Romano family was expert at exploiting vulnerabilities. The flight was a ghost flight. Mostly empty. The cabin dark and quiet. I couldn't sleep. I just stared out the window at the blackness. The roar of the engines, a dull drone in my ears. I went over every detail of the Russo case. Dominic Romano Sr. was not a man to be trifled with. He ran his organization with a brutal efficiency that had kept law enforcement at bay for decades. Sophia's husband had been his personal accountant, the keeper of all his secrets. When he died of a sudden heart attack, Sophia knew she and her children were next. She came to us with ledgers, names, and offshore accounts enough to put Romano and his entire inner circle away for life. Her testimony was scheduled to begin in 3 weeks. The timing of the house sale couldn't be a coincidence. It was a targeted attack. My mother had been the unwitting weapon, and my sister's wedding was the excuse. My family's carelessness, their self-absorption, had given the mob the one thing they needed most: an address. When the plane began its descent into Virginia, the sun was just starting to rise. The sky was a pale, washed-out orange and pink. It looked peaceful. A new day. But I felt nothing but dread. A black SUV with government plates was waiting on the tarmac. Just as Thorne had promised. The driver, a marshal I didn't recognize, opened the door for me without a word. He didn't have to say anything. The grim set of his jaw said it all. The world I had built for myself, the one where I was competent and in control, was gone. I was no longer just Deputy Marshal Vance. I was the source of the breach, the daughter, the problem, and I was heading straight into the heart of the storm. The operations center at U.S. Marshall's headquarters was a place of controlled chaos. But as I walked through the double doors, a wave of silence seemed to follow me. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. Every eye in the room was on me, and I could feel their judgment, their curiosity, their pity. I kept my own eyes straight ahead, my jaw tight, and walked directly to the conference room at the far end of the floor. My uniform felt too tight, my skin too thin. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Deputy Chief Thorne stood at the head of a long, polished table. To his right sat Evelyn Sharp, the sharpest lawyer in the legal counsel's office. Her face a mask of stern neutrality. A few other grim-faced section chiefs from intel and tactical operations were scattered around the table, their folders closed, their hands steepled. They were all waiting for me. "Vance," Thorne said, his voice flat. He gestured to the only empty chair directly across from him. It felt like an interrogation seat. Sit. I sat. No one offered coffee. No one asked about my flight. The time for pleasantries was long past. Evelyn Sharp tapped the screen of her laptop, and an image of the sale agreement appeared on the large monitor on the wall. My signature wasn't on it. My mother's was scrawled in her familiar looping cursive right next to a line that read, Margaret Vance, acting with power of attorney. I felt a fresh stab of betrayal. She must have had that document drawn up years ago, and I'd forgotten or never even known. The buyers paid $850,000 in cash, Sharp said, her voice crisp and devoid of emotion. For a property valued at 2.8 million Dries. She let that hang in the air for a moment. A nearly $2 million loss. It wasn't a sale. It was a fire sale. A price designed for a quick, quiet transaction with no questions asked. The payment was wired from a domestic account. Sharp continued, clicking to the next slide. A corporate logo appeared on the screen. A simple generic design of a river flowing between two banks. The wire originated from a Delaware shell company, Blue Creek Equities LLC. My heart hammered against my ribs. A shell company. Cash. An impossibly low price. Every red flag in the book was waving. Thorne leaned forward, his eyes boring into me. His expression wasn't angry. It was something worse, cold. Analytical disappointment. Vance. That's not an accident, he said, his voice low and growly. That's a professional job. Someone didn't just stumble upon your house. Someone targeted your safe house. The room felt like it was shrinking. The air was getting thin. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. I had known it. Of course. I had felt it in my gut since the moment I read my mother's text. But hearing it said aloud in this room by my commanding officer made it devastatingly real. It hit me like a sheet of ice. My family hadn't just made a stupid, greedy mistake. They had been played. They were pawns in a much larger, more dangerous game. You think the Romanos knew? I asked, my voice barely a whisper when I finally spoke. Thorne's gaze didn't waver. I think your family handed them the address on a silver platter. I flinched as if I'd been struck. He wasn't accusing me, not directly, but the shame was overwhelming. My family? My weakness. He didn't have to say it. The connection was clear. Sharp brought up another slide. It was a map of my parents' neighborhood. A wealthy suburb with a country club at its center. She highlighted the club. Your father plays golf there 3 times a week, she said. Your mother is on the board of the Garden Society. They're well known. They talk. My stomach twisted. I knew what she was implying. I had seen it my whole life. My parents loved to talk. They loved to brag about Chloe's perfect fiancé, about their new car, about their smart, successful daughter who worked for the government in D.C. and had a big important-sounding job she could never discuss, and about the beautiful, expensive house their daughter owned but never used. A fact they probably lamented over cocktails and dinner parties. "We have an informant," Thorne said, his voice dropping even lower. "A waiter at the club. He's been on the Romano payroll for years. He says your parents have been complaining about you letting that lovely house go to waste for months." It was common knowledge among the club members. All it took was one person in that room to be listening. One person to make a call. I closed my eyes. I could picture it perfectly. My mother holding a glass of wine, laughing with her friends, saying, "Oh, that daughter of mine, always so busy with her government work. She has this stunning colonial in Alexandria, a gift from her grandfather, and she just lets it sit there. Can you imagine?" She hadn't just sold a house. She had advertised its availability. "So the Romanos found out the house was mine," I said, piecing it together, the words tasting like ash. They knew I was a marshal. They put two and two together. "They didn't just get two and two," Thorne corrected me, his voice sharp as a razor. "They got the whole damn equation. They knew a marshal on their case had an empty house nearby. It was too perfect. They took a shot. And because of your family's greed, it paid off." I felt sick. Utterly and completely sick. My parents, in their bubble of wealth and privilege, had been so obsessed with my sister's wedding and their own social standing that they had broadcast the location of a federal safe house to anyone who would listen. They hadn't sold the house to a shell company. They had sold it directly to the mob. The room was silent. I looked at the faces around the table. They weren't just the faces of my colleagues anymore. They were the faces of people whose lives I had just made infinitely more difficult and dangerous. The faces of people who had trusted me. "What's the status of the witness?" I asked, forcing my voice steady. I was still a marshal. I still had a job to do. Thorne's expression hardened. "She's still in the house. The buyers haven't made a move yet, but the clock is ticking." He pushed himself to his feet. "And we're going in now." The drive to Alexandria was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I was in the back of an armored SUV, part of a 3-vehicle convoy that moved through the early morning traffic with silent, grim efficiency. No lights. No sirens. We were a ghost mission. The goal was to get in and out before anyone, especially the new owners, knew we were there. I sat next to Thorne, my hands clenched into fists, my eyes fixed on the familiar streets outside my window. The quiet suburban roads I knew from my childhood. The neatly manicured lawns. The big welcoming houses. It all looked so normal. So peaceful. But I knew it was a lie. A threat was hiding behind that peaceful facade. A threat my family had invited in. The tactical team was in the vehicle ahead of us. 6 men dressed in black, armed with rifles and suppressed weapons. They were the best at what they did. But they shouldn't have been here. They shouldn't have been needed. As we turned onto my street, My breath caught in my throat. There it was. The house. The afternoon sun glinted off the windows. The old oak tree stood sentinel on the lawn. It looked exactly as I remembered it from the last time I'd driven by. A silent monument to a life I didn't lead. But now it looked like a trap. We pulled up a block away. The TAC team disembarked, moving with a fluid, silent precision that was both terrifying and comforting. They fanned out, creating a perimeter, their eyes scanning every window, every car, every shadow. Thorne and I got out and approached the house on foot. Agent Kowalski, the lead agent on Sophia's permanent security detail, met us at the front door before we even reached it. His face was a mixture of confusion and alarm. "Sir," he said, his voice a low whisper. "We weren't notified of any change in protocol." He looked at me, his eyes asking a question I didn't want to answer. "You are now," Thorne said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We're evacuating immediately. The asset has been compromised." Kowalski's face went pale, but his training kicked in. He nodded once, sharply, and unlocked the door. "Understood. Sir, I'll get them ready." We stepped inside. The house was quiet. A half-finished puzzle was laid out on the living room floor. A child's drawing was taped to the refrigerator. It was a home. A safe place. A place I had provided. And a place I had just destroyed. Sophia Russo was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea steaming in front of her. She looked up as we entered, and a flicker of fear crossed her face. She was a strong woman, but the last year had taken its toll. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her shoulders were held in a permanent state of tension. "Did they find us?" she asked, her voice barely audible. My heart ached with guilt. This was my fault. I stepped forward, trying to keep my voice calm and reassuring, the way they'd trained us to. "No, ma'am," I said softly. "Everyone is safe, but there has been a security concern. We need to move you to a new location. You need to pack now." Her eyes darted from my face to Thorne's, then to the armed marshal standing by the door. She understood. She didn't ask questions. She just nodded, her face grim, and stood up. "Kids," she called out, her voice trembling only slightly. "Get your go bags. Now. It's time for another trip." The next 10 minutes were a whirlwind of quiet, frantic activity. The two children appeared, their faces etched with a fear that no child should ever know. They moved with a sad, practiced resignation, grabbing the small backpacks that were always kept ready by their beds. They knew the drill. I watched as Sophia spoke to them in low, soothing Italian, her hands gently guiding them, her face a brave mask for their benefit. She was a mother first, a witness second, and my mother had nearly gotten her children killed for the sake of a wedding party. The thought was so grotesque, so deeply shameful, that I had to look away. I did a final sweep of the upstairs rooms, my service weapon drawn, my senses on high alert. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside the window sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The house no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a tomb. Within 10 minutes, it was done. Sophia and her children, carrying nothing but their small bags, were escorted out the back door by the tactical team. I watched from the kitchen window as they were placed into a different armored SUV, one that would take them to a new, undisclosed location. Their lives, which had been hanging by a thread, were secure for now. They were seconds away from a potential disaster, and they never even knew how close it had come. As the SUV carrying the Russos pulled away, a profound sense of relief washed over me, immediately followed by a cold, rising tide of anger. They were safe now. It was time to deal with the people who had put them in danger. The convoy moved out, leaving the quiet Alexandria street behind. The Safehouse was empty. A crime scene. It was no longer my house. It was a piece of federal evidence. I was in the back of the lead SUV again. The silence inside the vehicle heavy and suffocating. The adrenaline from the evacuation was fading, replaced by a deep, weary ache. I felt hollowed out. We drove for a while without speaking. I watched the blur of the city pass by, my mind a blank slate of exhaustion and shame. Finally, Thorne turned to me, his face set like granite. "Your parents. Where are they?" It wasn't a question. It was a demand for information. "Family reunion," I answered, my voice flat. "My uncle's farm in Pennsylvania. It's an annual thing. An event I had begged off of for the past 5 years. Citing work. An event I now had to attend in the worst possible way. We have the address." One of the agents in the front seat confirmed, looking at the GPS on his dashboard. "Good," Thorne said. "That's where we're going now." I looked at him, confused. "Sir, we're not waiting for them to get back to their house. We're not giving them time to talk, to get their stories straight, or to call a lawyer. We are going to confront them while they are surrounded by family, feeling safe and comfortable. We are going to hit them with this right in the middle of their perfect little world." His logic was cold, tactical, and brutally effective. It was also horrifying. He wanted to use the reunion, the symbol of our family's togetherness, as a weapon. He looked straight at me, his eyes unblinking. "Bring a recorder," he ordered. The words landed like a physical blow. A recorder. That single instruction changed everything. This wasn't going to be a painful family conversation. It was going to be an official interview, a formal part of a federal investigation. He was ordering me to record my own parents for use as evidence against them. "You understand what I'm asking?" "Vance," he said, his voice softer now, but no less firm. "When we get there, you're not going to be Elena. You're not going to be their daughter. You are a deputy U.S. Marshal, and they are persons of interest in a catastrophic security breach that has endangered 3 federal witnesses and compromised a multi-year investigation into a major criminal organization." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "You are about to face them not as their daughter, but as a federal officer. Can you do that?" I stared out the window at the highway stretching before us. The road to Pennsylvania. The road to the farm where I'd spent summers as a child, chasing fireflies and listening to my grandfather's stories. It was a place of happy memories, of innocence. Now I was returning as an instrument of justice, poised to shatter my own family. My entire life, I had felt like an outsider in my own family. They operated on a different frequency, one of social status, appearances, and gossip. I had chosen a world of duty, of consequences, of quiet, necessary violence. I had always kept those worlds apart. Now Thorne was telling me I had to choose. But there was no choice. Really? There hadn't been from the moment I read that text. My mother, my father, my sister, they had made their choice when they decided a wedding was more important than my career. More important than my warnings to them over the years to never, ever discuss my life or my property. They had chosen to endanger innocent people through their own selfish carelessness. Now I had to make my choice. I thought of Sophia Russo's face, the terror in her eyes. I thought of her 2 children clutching their go-bags, their childhood stolen from them. They were my responsibility. My duty was to them. I turned back to Thorne. My voice was steady, without a trace of the storm raging inside me. "Understood, sir." He nodded slowly. A flicker of something respect, maybe, or pity in his eyes. "All right then," he said. "Let's go to a family reunion." The SUV ate up the miles, heading north toward Pennsylvania. With every mile that passed, I felt the daughter in me receding, replaced by the cold, calm focus of the marshal. I was compartmentalizing, building walls inside my mind, locking away the memories and the hurt. I had a job to do, and I would do it no matter what it cost me. If this story touches you, please subscribe to the channel and share the video to help me develop better. The drive to my uncle's farm took nearly 3 hours. For 3 hours, I sat in silence. The recorder, a small, heavy weight in my pocket. I watched the green hills of Pennsylvania roll by, images of summer picnics and childhood games flickering in my mind like ghosts. They were memories from another life. A life that was about to be permanently erased. When we arrived, we parked the 3 black SUVs at the bottom of the long gravel driveway, hidden from the main house by a line of old maple trees. We walked the rest of the way. The scene was exactly as I'd pictured it. My uncle's sprawling farmhouse, the big red barn, and a wide green lawn filled with people. My family aunts, uncles, cousins all laughing and talking. Kids were running barefoot through the grass, chasing a kite. The air smelled of freshly cut hay and barbecue smoke from the massive grill my uncle proudly manned. It was a perfect picture of wholesome, happy American family life. A perfect lie. My mother was the first to see me. She was standing by a long picnic table laden with food, a glass of iced tea in her hand. Her face lit up with a brilliant, genuine smile. For a heartbreaking second, she wasn't the woman who had ruined my life. She was just my mom, happy to see her daughter. "Elena," she called out, her voice warm and full of surprise. "Oh my goodness. You came! I can't believe you actually came." She started walking toward me, her arms open for a hug. But then she saw Thorne and the two other grim-faced marshals flanking me. Her smile faltered. Her steps slowed. The confusion on her face was quickly replaced by a flicker of apprehension. The badges on our belts were discreet, but not invisible. "Elena, what is this?" she asked, her voice dropping to a cautious whisper. "Who are these people?" I stopped a few feet from her. I couldn't let her touch me. The laughter around us was already beginning to die down as people started to notice the quiet, official-looking group that had just appeared. I looked past my mother and saw my father, Arthur Vance, by the grill talking to my uncle. He was laughing, a spatula in his hand. I saw my sister Chloe sitting with her fiancé, showing off her engagement ring to our cousins. They all looked so happy, so oblivious. I took a breath and let the truth fall into the middle of their perfect day like a stone into a still pond. "You sold federal property, Mom," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried in the sudden hush that was falling over the lawn. The house in Alexandria. It was a safe house. The laughter died instantly. Every head turned toward us. My mother stared at me, her mouth slightly open, the color draining from her face. My father had stopped mid-sentence, the smile frozen on his face. He walked over slowly, wiping his hands on his apron. "What are you talking about?" he said. His eyes narrowed. He looked at Thorne, then back at me. His expression, one of complete disbelief. "That's impossible. You work in administration. Some kind of clerk." It was the same dismissive tone he'd used my entire life. The condescension. The complete refusal to understand or acknowledge what I did. He saw my life as a boring, safe desk job. He had no concept of the reality. All those years of biting my tongue, of letting them believe their version of my life were over. "I am a deputy U.S. Marshal," I said, my voice clear and steady. I looked him directly in the eye. "And you just compromised an ongoing federal case." A collective gasp went through the crowd of relatives. My father blinked, stunned into silence. He looked at my mother, who was shaking her head in denial. That's when Chloe scrambled to her feet, her face a mask of panicked self-interest. "Wait. What do you mean?" she stammered, looking from me to my parents. "But the money. The money went to my wedding." The sheer selfishness of her words, even in this moment, was breathtaking. She didn't ask if anyone was in danger. She didn't ask what we had done. Her first and only thought was about the money. I turned my gaze to her. The pity I might have once felt was gone, burned away by the events of the last 12 hours. "That money," I said, my voice as cold and hard as steel, "came from the illegal sale of government property. It's being seized as evidence." Chloe's face crumpled. Her fiancé, a man whose expensive tastes were about to be a matter of federal record, looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. The perfect wedding, the perfect life, was dissolving right in front of her. And all she could do was stare at me with wide, horrified eyes. The party was over. The truth was out, laid bare on the perfectly manicured lawn, and there was no taking it back. The silence that followed my announcement was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered the cheerful party atmosphere. My aunts and uncles and cousins just stood there, frozen, their plates of food forgotten. This was no longer a family reunion. It was a crime scene, and my parents were the primary suspects. My father finally found his voice, sputtering with indignation. "This is ridiculous. It was Elena's house. A gift from her grandfather. We had power of attorney. There's been a misunderstanding." He was trying to take control, to smooth it over with the same casual authority he used at his country club board meetings. But this wasn't a boardroom, and the man standing next to me wasn't a fellow board member. Just then, Thorne's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, glanced at the screen, and his already grim expression darkened further. He looked up, first at my parents, then at me. He gave me a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. "There is no misunderstanding, Mr. Vance," Thorne said, his voice cutting through my father's blustering. He held up his phone. "We've just confirmed the identity of the buyers. The shell company, Blue Creek Equities, is a front. It's owned by a holding corporation that is, in turn, owned by the Romano family." The name landed in the silence with the force of a physical impact. Even my parents, in their insulated world, knew that name. Everyone knew the Romanos. My mother's knees buckled. She let out a small, strangled gasp and put a hand on my father's arm to steady herself. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, we didn't know. We would never." Her voice trailed off. I looked at her, at the genuine terror that was finally breaking through her layers of denial, and I felt nothing but a cold, empty finality. "You didn't ask," I said, my voice flat. You talked. Though, Thorne added, his tone sharp and accusatory. He took a step forward, his presence commanding the absolute attention of everyone on the lawn. You talked about the house at your country club. You complained that your daughter, the federal employee, was letting a multi-million-dollar asset sit empty. You did everything but put a for sale sign on the lawn. My father paled, his blustering defense crumbling into dust. He looked at my mother, a horrified understanding dawning on his face. An informant overheard you, Thorne continued, pressing his advantage. A mob informant who has been working at your club for years. He passed along the information. The Romanos heard that a U.S. Marshal had an unused house in a quiet neighborhood. They put an offer together. A lowball cash offer they knew a greedy, careless person wouldn't be able to resist. And they were right. Each word was a nail in the coffin of their ignorance. They couldn't claim it was a mistake anymore. They couldn't pretend they were innocent victims. Their own actions, their own words, their own character flaws had led directly to this. My dad's voice cracked, the sound thin and reedy. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for the first time in his life. So we sold a Safehouse to the mob. The question hung in the humid summer air. All around us, our family stood like statues, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning horror. Yes, I said, the single word sealing their fate. I let them absorb the weight of it before I delivered the final, devastating blow. You did more than that. You gave them the address to a woman who was about to testify against them. You gave them the address to her and her 2 children. Silence. Then a small, choked whisper from my sister. Oh my God! The reality of what they had done had finally penetrated her world of wedding dresses and financial statements. It wasn't about the money being seized. It was about the lives that had almost been lost. For the first time, she understood. They all did. In that moment of stunned silence, Evelyn Sharp stepped forward. I hadn't even realized she was part of the team that had come with us. But it made tactical sense. Thorne wanted every part of this to be by the book. She held a file in her hands, her expression as impassive and professional as it had been in the briefing room. Arthur and Margaret Vance, she announced, her voice clear and formal, carrying across the lawn to every frozen guest. You are under investigation for violating Title 18, United States Code. Section 1512, witness tampering, and Section 641, theft of government property. You need to come with us. The legal jargon was like a foreign language, but the meaning was unmistakable. This was real. This was happening. My mother broke. A raw, piercing scream tore from her throat. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated panic. She lunged toward me, her hands outstretched, her face contorted with desperation. Elena. No, tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them we didn't know. Elena. Please. She was trying to grab my arms, to pull me into our old dynamic. The frantic mother, the dutiful daughter who would fix everything. But that daughter was gone. I took a half step back, just out of her reach. The movement was small, but it was a boundary made of iron. "I can't," I said, and my voice was calm, steady, and utterly final. "You endangered lives. Intent doesn't erase the consequences." One of the other marshals stepped forward and gently but firmly took my mother's arm. Another one moved to my father's side. They produced 2 sets of handcuffs. The metallic click as the cuffs were fastened around my mother's wrists echoed in the dead, silent air. The sound seemed to break the spell. My aunts and uncles started whispering, some crying. Chloe was openly sobbing, her fiancé standing beside her, looking utterly lost. My father didn't resist. He just stood there, his shoulders slumped in defeat as the marshal cuffed his hands behind his back. But as they started to lead him away, he turned his head and looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading shame. "We're your parents," he said, his voice cracking. It was his last card to play. A final appeal to a bond he had never truly honored, but expected to save him now. I met his gaze. I thought of Sophia Russo packing a go bag. I thought of her little boy's quiet, scared face. I thought of the promise of protection my badge represented. "And Sophia Russo is a mother," I said, my voice low and clear, meant only for him. "You nearly got her children killed." His face fell. The last bit of fight went out of him. He understood. There was nothing left to say. There were no more excuses. As the marshals escorted my parents past the stunned onlookers toward the black SUVs waiting at the end of the driveway, the family reunion completely disintegrated. The perfect facade had been shattered, revealing the ugly truth underneath. My family was not the happy, successful unit they pretended to be. They were broken, and I was the one who had been forced to break them. I stood there on the lawn, the recorder still in my pocket, feeling the eyes of my entire extended family on me. They weren't looking at me with love or sympathy. They were looking at me with fear, with confusion, with resentment. I was one of them. But I had just brought the full, terrifying weight of the outside world down upon their heads. In their eyes, I was no longer family. I was the law. And I had never felt more alone. The months that followed were a quiet, grinding process. The high drama of the arrest gave way to the slow, methodical turning of the wheels of justice. I was put on administrative leave for the duration of the internal investigation, a standard procedure. I spent those weeks in my sterile DC apartment, feeling like a ghost in my own life. I didn't answer calls from family. There was nothing to say. The case against my parents was swift and brutal. The evidence was overwhelming. The recorded conversation at the farm, the financial records showing the cash transfer from the Romano Front Company into an account for my sister's wedding, the testimony from the country club informant. My parents' high-priced lawyer tried to argue that they were unwitting pawns. But the prosecution painted a simple, damning picture of greed and criminal negligence. The judge agreed. The verdict came down in a quiet, fluorescent-lit courtroom 6 months later. My father was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. My mother, seen as slightly less culpable, received 3 years, to be followed by 5 years of supervised release. Chloe's perfect life imploded. The money was seized as proceeds of a crime. The wedding was canceled. Her fiancé, whose family name was now linked to a mob investigation in the society pages, left her within a month. The last I heard. She was working as a receptionist and had moved into a small apartment she could barely afford. But while my personal world was a field of wreckage, my professional world saw a string of victories. Armed with the information from the compromised sale and a now furious Sophia Russo, the task force moved with ruthless efficiency. The new intelligence led to the arrest of 3 key Romano associates who had facilitated the deal. The organization began to crumble from the inside. Sophia and her children were kept in deep protection. When the time came, she testified. Her testimony was masterful, clear, precise, and unshakable. She laid out the entire Romano criminal enterprise, from the offshore accounts to the acts of violence. Her words put Dominic Romano Sr. away for life without the possibility of parole. I was in the back of the courtroom when the verdict was read. I watched Romano's face remain a mask of stone as his fate was sealed. I felt no triumph, no elation, just a quiet, profound sense of an ending, a job done. After the courtroom cleared, Thorne found me standing in the empty hallway. He came and stood beside me, and for a long time, we just watched the court officers lead the last of the Romano crew away in cuffs. "You did the right thing, Vance," he said finally, his voice low. I looked at the polished marble floor. "Doesn't feel like it," I said honestly. He nodded, his gaze distant. "Justice rarely does," he replied. "It's not about feeling good. It's about balance. It's about consequences. Your parents face theirs. The Romanos face theirs. And Sophia Russo and her kids get to have a life. That's the balance. That's the win." He was right. I knew. But the cost of that win felt impossibly high. I had upheld the law. I had protected the innocent. I had done my duty. But I had lost my family in the process. And as I walked out of the courthouse into the cold afternoon air, I wasn't sure if that was a balance I could ever learn to live with. 2 years passed. 2 years of quiet, steady work. I was cleared by the internal investigation and went back to my job. I was good at it. Better. Even. The experience had forged something hard and unbreakable in my core. I was trusted with more sensitive cases, more high-stakes assignments. My life became my work. Entirely and completely. It was simpler that way. One afternoon, A letter with a federal penitentiary return address arrived in my office mail. It was from my mother. Her handwriting was shaky. Nothing like the confident loops I remembered. I opened it and scanned the pages. It was full of apologies, guilt, and promises to be better. She wrote about how she finally understood, how she was so sorry for not seeing me, for not listening. It was everything a daughter might want to hear. I read it once, my face impassive. Then I folded the sheets of paper, slid them back into the envelope, and opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. I placed the letter inside the thick file labeled U, as Moke, versus Romano et al. It was just one more piece of evidence in a case that was now closed. I shut the drawer. Thorne found me a few minutes later, leaning against the window of my office, looking down at the busy DC streets below. He had a new title now, director, but he was still the same man. He nodded toward my desk. "Heard you got a letter," he said. "News travels fast." He came and stood beside me, following my gaze out the window. "You going to forgive her?" he asked quietly. I thought about it for a moment. Forgiveness felt like something soft, something for people whose worlds hadn't been shattered. It felt like a betrayal of the terrified look on Sophia Russo's face. It felt like an excuse for the carelessness that had nearly cost 3 lives. I shook my head slowly. "Not today," I said. He nodded, accepting my answer without judgment. "You chose duty over family," he said. More a statement of fact than a question. "That's not easy." I watched a motorcade snake its way through traffic far below. The city hummed on, busy, alive, and completely indifferent to the small dramas of the people within it. A profound sense of clarity settled over me, a truth I had been circling for 2 years. "It wasn't family I lost," I said quietly, the words feeling more real than anything I'd said in a long time. "You can't lose something you never really had. I lost the trust I had in them. I lost the hope that they would ever see me for who I am." It was the truth. My family had been a collection of people who shared my blood, but they had never shared my world, my values, or my purpose. They didn't know me. My real family was here, in this building. It was the other marshals who had my back. It was the witnesses we protected. It was the duty we all shared. Thorne was silent for a moment, and then he clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Come on, Vance," he said. "Let's get some coffee." As I turned to leave, I glanced out the window one last time, and I thought about Sophia Russo's children. They would be 10 and 8 now, somewhere in another state, under a new name. They were probably just getting home from school. Maybe they were running around in their backyard, laughing, their voices bright and carefree. They were safe. They had a future. And that's why I never regretted a single thing. I pressed my hands into the rich, dark soil, firming it around the base of a young maple tree. The air smelled of damp earth and new beginnings. In the distance, I could hear the sound of children's laughter drifting through the crisp autumn air. I was in the Higgins and Arthur Memorial Garden. It was a small public park, a patch of green and quiet in the middle of the city. I had bought the derelict lot it stood on and funded its creation. There were flower beds and benches, a small playground, and a community reading circle. It was named for the two people who had, in their own ways, given me my freedom: Mrs. Higgins, whose simple need for kindness had been my breaking point, and Grandpa Arthur, who had given me the key to unlock my own life. Mrs. Higgins was sitting on a bench near the playground, reading a story to a group of neighborhood children. She was warm and safe, her new furnace long since installed, her winters now comfortable. After her landlord had tried to evict her, I had bought her building, lowered the rents for all the elderly tenants, and funded a proper maintenance program. It was a small thing, really, a footnote in the Orion Fund's portfolio, but it felt more real than any billion-dollar acquisition. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a news alert. Apex Financial Group announces record quarter, following major restructuring. Michael Ross had kept his job. The bank had survived. My paused withdrawal had forced them to clean house, to trim the fat, to actually pay attention to their culture. They were stronger for it. I never heard from Victoria again. I heard through the grapevine that she had moved to another state, taking a much lower-level job at a small credit union. Isabella had quietly paid back the money she had stolen. My parents sent a single, stiff letter asking for a reconciliation, which I never answered. They were ghosts from a former life. The transfer of $4.2 billion was the loudest thing I had ever done. But it wasn't my greatest act. The real act of power, the one that truly changed my life, was the quiet withdrawal of my love and my loyalty from people who had bankrupted my spirit. I had spent a lifetime making deposits into a family account that gave me nothing in return. Closing it was the single most profitable transaction I ever made. I stood up and brushed the dirt from my hands, looking at the small, hopeful maple tree. It would grow tall here. It would be seen. I looked out at the peaceful garden, at the smiling faces, and felt a sense of quiet contentment that no amount of money could ever buy. If you've ever been mocked for being small, if you've ever been made to feel invisible, remember this: silence isn't weakness, it's leverage. Like, comment, and subscribe, because the best revenge is quiet freedom.